Hey, welcome everyone. I hope you're having a good day. I'm here with Samuel Barnes. We're going to talk about his new book, Iconoclast. So, Samuel, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for anyone who hasn't come across you before and give us a very brief summary of Iconoclast and what it is?
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm Samuel Barnes. I'm a writer. I write philosophy, and I recently put out the Iconoclast. Um, yeah. So the Iconoclast is essentially an answer to the question, "What is philosophy?" Now, anyone who's kind of read one of the many books on that question knows that most of these texts are pretty dry. They fall within the confines of the sort of quite tomish nature of philosophical texts in the contemporary world, unfortunately. And also, one of my sort of problems with them, which I found a bit wanting, was they go in with an angle. They go in with, okay, this is what I'm expecting the answer to be, or someone's got a sort of an interest in what the answer could be. For example, like they could just say, okay, philosophy is all about education, and because they're an educator, then that all fits together, right? So I kind of wanted to go in without those preconceptions, and I didn't want to go in with an idea of what I wanted the answer to be in terms of what philosophy is. I think all the best books are like that, like I think all the best books, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, I feel like it's a genuine journey for the writer to find the answer. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the kind of the main premise of the book, the main question of the book. But it's partially autobiographical. Like the reason I thought this was important was, I've been like doing philosophy for a couple of years now. Probably not as much as some other people, but basically, I sort of, whenever anyone will ask me why are you interested in this subject, I would sort of answer with some sort of platitude about meaning of life, or some sort of like ethical like question, like what it means to be good, that sort of thing. But I realized that um, my real reason for being interested in philosophy, if I was completely honest with myself, is that it's the meta question. It's kind of above everything in a sense. It is the ultimate question. For every single X you can think of, there is a philosophy of X. There's a philosophy of science. There's a philosophy of history. There's a philosophy of mathematics. There is no other subject which has that sort of status as the meta question. And I feel like when it comes down to everything kind of ultimate about humanity, whether it's our values, our destiny and eschatology, or the way we act, it all comes back to a philosophical question at the end of the day. So that's kind
Yes.
of set up for the book, basically.
Okay, nice. Okay, so I want to get into like the definitional distinctions for people who haven't read it before, like meta and sub. But before that, I just wanted to say the thing about the philosophical supremacy. Did you know that if you click on a hyperlink in Wikipedia, enough times it eventually goes to philosophy. You'll eventually land on the philosophy page. Like it's like this
Really?
weird, mysterious algorithmic thing.
Uh-huh.
It's like a famous thing that's well, not a famous thing, but it's a kind of infamous thing, and there's even a Wikipedia page about it. So it kind of shows you that philosophy has this kind of like king rank above all the other kind of schools of thought and so on. And we'll go into why and how in a minute. The other thing I just wanted to comment on was this funny question of like, why do you do philosophy? I think it's this really funny thing because like I normally brush it off as well by say it's kind of just it's an interest, it's a hobby, but it's not. But I don't know how else to explain it. I almost feel like I'm
Right.
gonna freak people out if I go into it in detail. Like it's not just a
Yeah,
career,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
it's a vocation, it's everything. If people think he's being radicalized or something. Um, but anyway, let's go into. You have this distinction, which is kind of important for understanding what iconoclasm is, and it's the distinction between the meta question and the sub question. So, could you maybe just give us a distinction?
Yeah. So again, coming back to philosophy as the meta question, the way I've sort of laid these things out in definition is, yeah, I've said, okay, for every X there's a philosophy of X, but something you also realize about all of the other inquiries, whether it's science, mathematics, etc., is that they are all based on some sort of presupposed axiom or axioms, and kind of the cognitive inquiry kind of flows out from that point. Philosophy, at least like philosophy proper, one that hasn't been captured by some sort of human want. The previous answers to the question, what is philosophy, are actually a good example of that. But it essentially doesn't have any like predefined axioms. Like genuine philosophy doesn't fence off things, doesn't like, put limits on things. For example, there are like answers to philosophical questions that could be very dangerous for us to admit or know even. To give an example of the sub-question, one of the sub-questions and kind of the axioms it flows from is just to take physics, for example, because physics in a metaphysical sense is based on materialism. It's got these other further axioms of the assumption of a contiguous natural law. So those are natural laws that apply to the physical world and are fixed and static. And so these are axioms that are presupposed by every sort of empirical inquiry, and the sort of physical, all the physical cognitive activity sort of flows from that. In that sub-question of physics, you can't all of a sudden wedge in some metaphysical supernaturalism. It just doesn't apply to physics, right? So in that sense, that's its fence basically. It sort of fenced itself in. And like, I've just given an example of, if you have a metaphysical supernaturalism, for example, if you believe in like an omnipresent and all-powerful God, there you go. There's your axiom from which one of your axioms from which a religious sub-question can flow. Philosophy doesn't assume any of this. This is why in philosophy you actually have metaphysics as a question. So I hope that kind of helps the reason why I had this distinction.
So the Iconoclast kind of, we could say, embodies this thinking without axioms.
Yeah. So yeah, just to go on a little bit further, I kind of, from those definitions, I define, I call them like cognitive archetypes. I wouldn't call them archetypes in like the Jungian sense, but they're certainly like modes of thinking, right? So when you're in the purely philosophical mode of thinking, when things truly aren't off limits, you're thinking it with iconoclasm in mind. I've called it. I call it this because generally this sort of philosophizing can be a very destructive force, but sometimes rightly destructive to give a space where new things can be created. For example, the rejection of traditional religiosity is an example of a time of iconoclasm, which made way for the modern world to kind of take root in terms of what people were allowed to think. And the other sort of mental mode of thinking I've defined is the dogmatist. Now, the dogmatist is someone who is within one of those sub-questions. So if someone's really, really wedded to the sub-question of physics or mathematics, then there are these axioms, and if you even try and question them, you're almost speaking a different language. So the cognitive inquiry in that sense, it's bounded, but there are great cathedrals built to both religion and science despite their dogmatic nature.
Yeah. So the dogmatist, we could say, is distinct, that he's thinking from a dogmatic axiom, and he's moving from there. You have some sort of like temporal analogies, maybe of like kind of the dogmatist is thinking in a more linear sense. He's moving from one axiom and he's building and building on top of this.
Mm-hmm.
But the iconoclast would it be correct to say, is kind of floating over nothingness constantly. He's not building in that same sense.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I sort of come to one of the first realizations of the book, which is the possibility of an anti-philosophical conclusion, right? Like it's not entirely clear to me whether that sort of definition of philosophizing, that sort of definition of thought is that something that we can do as humans? Is it something desirable that we'd want to do that? Like, is there a reason for that? Because it almost feels like for us to even think, we have to have predefined axioms, right?
Yeah. Well, I, as you were saying, that is the distinct thing about philosophy, that it's able to float without these axioms, where everything else, like if you were to go into a course if you were to do a degree in like geography, and then you were suddenly to question materialism, everyone would look at you like you're insane. Like, why are you here? So right. In philosophy, though, you can move from that kind of lack of an axiom. You can move from that lack of grounding, which is distinct, which is unique about it. So maybe to move from the kind of more abstract theoretical kind of structure of the book to the kind of questions which arise from this distinction and the kind of more observable phenomena we can maybe apply. Um, there's this, there's a few, well, there's a lot of different areas we could go with this, but I suppose the question of like the so well, usefulness is probably a kind of vulgar term, but
Right. Yeah.
the kind of value and benefit of iconoclastic thinking is kind of hard to grasp. It's kind of hard to actually locate. Like we can all see the benefit of dogmatic thinking in a sense. Like um, if you were being invaded by a foreign enemy and we were all going to die, and then someone started saying, "Well, what's the point in living anyway?" They wouldn't be very helpful in defending your country. So it's kind of like there's certain situations where that kind of iconoclastic thinking is just like I suppose there's a risk of seeing it as purely nihilistic, and I'm sure like I grasp from the book that it's not purely nihilistic. There is a proper value to it. So maybe I suppose how do we get into that value? Like where is that value located, or can we locate it?
Right. You're right to bring up the fact that language is almost inherently valuing in a sense, because as soon as you say, okay, what is the usefulness of philosophy, you're almost like at that point you immediately snap into like a utilitarian sub question in a way. And this is the important thing, and this is exactly part of the question: is you know are we able to achieve that sort of iconoclasm? Or as soon as we say, is this a useful inquiry? Is this a useful thing to do we immediately snap into some sort of dogmatism by doing that? And so what I kind of am trying to get at is that it doesn't only bring into question the use, utility, and good of philosophy, but it also brings into question our ability to philosophize in a pure cognitive sense. And the eventuality might be that we're actually trapped in these dogmatisms as human beings, basically.
What came to mind when I was reading it was one of the dangers of the dogmatist, which then brought about the sort of benefit kind of by proxy of the danger of the dogmatist, or by the limitation of the dogmatist, it brought about the value of the iconoclast. So I suppose I kind of thought about the dogmatist in a sense of he's kind of got this axiom, this dogmatic axiom, and he builds from it constantly, and he builds and builds and builds, and he's very good at building and very good at progressing and very good at getting higher, but he's not very good at reevaluating.
Mm-hmm.
He's not very good at going, okay, well, we've kind of reached a limit, or what we're doing doesn't really make sense anymore, and we have to go back. That seems to be when the iconoclast suddenly goes from being the weird guy in the room to being like the guy who might be onto something.
Yeah. This is the question as well. We have these mental modes, right? Presumably. Yeah. Now, okay, we're asking the question of whether one of them is even accessible to us. But regardless, it's very clear that there are sometimes epochs where things are too orderly, too oppressively dogmatic, and times where things are too chaotic and nothing's set in stone enough. So it's very clear to me that we can at least take from this the fact that there are times in which iconoclasm should be employed, and there are times in which dogmatism can be employed. Both of them, like you said, they have their issues. Like this continual construction of dogmatism leads to all sorts of weird sort of eschatologies, and really hooks into the innate tribalism of human beings, I think. The dogmatist will always see the other as other, for example. Like someone who's really wedded to the scientific sub-questions is not just going to see those with a more supernatural metaphysics as incomprehensible, but is actually going to see them as a threat. And I think this is demonstrable with all various sort of ideologies and sub-questions that we could think of, right? And yeah, I think it sort of hooks into that innate tribalism of the other. And this is where, in that sense, I'm calling dogmatism a very human thing, in both positive and negative ways. But calling that's sort of one. This is another realization which really leads into the anti-philosophical bent of the book, which is that this pure philosophizing, this iconoclasm, it seems very inhuman, right? By virtue of that. So yeah, it's an open question.
And the 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 dogmatist, he's not just threatened intellectually. Like, this is, I think, what came out in the book was very much like the kind of emotional investment and the existential investment we have into our
Mhm.
axioms. And
Yeah.
when they start to crumble, or when they start to become bad groundings, or groundings that don't really function or make sense anymore, um, the defense of them can be quite, um, vicious. And you can see things, you can think of Socrates, for example,
Mhm.
as being
Mhm.
someone who is. Would you think Socrates was an iconoclast?
Um, I don't know. I don't think I'm not actually well read enough on Socrates to give a definitive answer to that. I feel like most good philosophers, and I think that, well, most very important slash good philosophers, and I definitely think Socrates is one of those. They have moments of iconoclasm and they have moments of dogmatism. I think the worst philosophy is written by people who are either completely one way or the other.
Mm.
Um, I think like genuine discovery and genuine questioning comes from that dance between those two modes of being. Those modes of thinking. I don't know. What do you think?
Um, I think he must have been something like an iconoclast if he was ordered to be exiled or executed. So,
Sure.
like he's got to be doing something to invoke that kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose he must be doing, like, I would assume intuitively yes, but it depends, of course, how we define iconoclasm and so on. But
Mm-hmm.
um, there's also the kind of institutional angles of this, and I think
Mm-hmm.
you sort of apply Albert Hirschman's theories um, to kind of, I suppose, exemplify these different archetypes. So do you want to go into that a little bit, and how the um, I don't know how you put it, institutional cycles of maybe peak and decline, it seemed to me,
Yeah.
affect how these archetypes correspond to that process.
Yeah. So I tried to use Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty to kind of try and understand some sort of cognitive economy in which these sorts of sub questions, these inquiries, and these mental nodes might fit together. I've had some criticism on that because I can kind of understand how it's a bit of a stretch. Um, Although I think that Hirschman's theories are sort of broad enough in which they can kind of be applied to, I think they can be applied to any sort of human like transactional economy. I think intellectual economies are they fall within that category. So basically what I wanted to do is, instead of having what people might traditionally use Hirschman's theories for, when it comes to the dynamics of exit, voice, and loyalty within companies, um, political states, for example, those sorts of things. I wanted to apply them to these sub questions, right? Because I feel like these sub questions are human groupings, right? And there might be a sub question that revolves around the axioms of Christianity, and yet within that it's a superset, and it has further more specific sub questions of Christian denominations, all this sort of stuff. Um, and like you said, one of these denominations might have a belief in, okay, next Tuesday Jesus Christ is going to come back, right? And like you said, this stuff gets very emotional because, in contrast to the answers to what is philosophy, which come from academics and they answer in a very sort of abstract and lofty way, these things ultimately come back to an embodied context. Like the fact that you were in that cult for how many years and you put this much effort into it, and a certain part of you had to die for that, and then all of a sudden Jesus doesn't come back next Tuesday. You're faced with you're faced with a question there. It relates to exit, voice, and loyalty. Is your loyalty high enough that you just stick around, or do you exit that sub question and go somewhere else?
Yeah. There seems to also be the kind of theme of faith versus inquiry in
Yeah.
there as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to like simply distinguish those two things and say they're complete opposites, because they perhaps are not complete opposites. You could have faith in inquiry, for example, but it does seem to be a very timely book, because it comes about, I think, observably from institutions, academia, corporate, political. All of these things seem to be in a very much decline phase, and then
Mm-hmm.
and a very emotionally volatile phase. I think, if you were to go back to 30, 40 years ago and go to a university or work in a kind of media outlet, I'd imagine it would be almost like so drastically different.
Yeah.
The atmosphere, what you're allowed to do and say, how you're allowed to behave, all of these things. And I think that this is all within the same democratic secular society, and there hasn't been some massive religious changes.
Secular, secular.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the point. It's like, I think these archetypes are quite helpful because they describe something within a secular world, which isn't supposed to happen within a secular world, if you know what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of come at that with, like, from a kind of quite blankly logical angle. I mean, just to kind of reflect on what you just mentioned, like, it's very clear that we live in a time of this relates to what the cognitive economy I was trying to get at through Hirschman. We live in a time of excess dogmatism where the function of the dogmatisms is not working anymore, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I said, that either causes people to completely exit and clock out, which is why you have people completely just completely not invested in the system anymore. And you have others who are completely invested in the system and are doubling down on the things that aren't working. So yeah, we're long overdue for a time of iconoclasm. But this is, I don't know, this definitely relates to your work on politics, is that, we apparently live in a secular time. And I think I would say this is one of the biggest takeaways from the book that people should really think about, is that through kind of thinking about everything that's below philosophy as a sub-question, I came to the realization that what we call religions, right? And I sort of said, okay, that's everything that falls into a category, like a sub-question category, where one of the axioms is some sort of metaphysical supernaturalism, right? Without the certainty in that supernaturalism, right? So that's the traditional religiosities. Now we've got this new thing called atheism, right? Which, as one of its axioms, is like, no, there definitely isn't any metaphysical supernaturalisms. Now, sort of using the skepticism of Thoreau, or at least Thoreau as he was written through Sextus Empiricus, which is one of the biggest sources of this book. Thoreaunism, so that's the original skepticism, is really influential here. Through that, I sort of realized that, well, actually, these things are equipolar. They're both making metaphysical assertions without necessitous proof of these things. So in that sense, the secular atheism is just as metaphysically assertive as a traditional religiosity. And it is in this sense, that I'm coming back to the fact that, as human beings, we eventually have to, assume that something's certain. We have, like, as embodied subjects, we have to assume something's certain, or else we can't really act or not act at all. And my realization was that, in a sense, that all human beings and all human societies are in some sense religious because of that certainty without proof, basically.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that religious sentiment does is it does allow quite cohesive action and collective action, because it's using dogma. I mean, like, if you think of the famous example is the 9/11 hijackers. It's like, how could they do this? And it's always like, how could you have such faith that you could do something so absurd, right?
Yeah.
This, and especially from the point of view of, like, the end of history in, like, the late 90s, early 2000s, where we're so secularized and we're so rational. It was such an intrusion. It kind of it was almost like an iconoclastic dogmatism, because it was like, through zealous faith, zealous absurd belief, people could do something so absurd, and it was like, well, how could you do that? And then it almost kind of undermined our own secular axioms, which we kind of presumed the world was going to just get more and more indefinitely rational and secular as time goes on. But anyway, not to talk about 9/11 too much, but it just reminds me of that a little bit. I have to bring up 9/11 at least once in every conversation. So,
yeah, you click enough links in Wikipedia, that's where you end up,
right? You go from 9/11 to philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird because, like I said, I think that all of these value systems that organize society are inherently dogmatic at some point, and this is not an original take. Like loads of people said this, but eventually, like when you get rid of one sub question, something else is going to come in and fill that space, right? And like I point out in the book, like these things, they come with their own inbuilt eschatology. They don't have to be religious to come with an eschatology, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, there was this assumption, especially with the Fukuyama end of history stuff, that, oh no, we're in a time of progressivism and things are just going to progress and get more and more secular and more democratic and more progressive and all these sorts of things. But that just makes it like a temporal assumption about the way history is going to go. Like there's no certainty that things are going to go in one direction. And what comes in to fill that is like you get all these very strange eschatologies that I don't think I really thought about that deeply. Like, science has this weird singularity / transhumanist thing. And it just has this assumption that, this inhuman thing that's going to replace us is somehow better. And you get loads of other eschatologies, which are religious in nature, that are based on these axioms of science, or at least the faith in what we call science, right? Like all the climate catastrophism stuff is, in a sense, an eschatology.
Yeah.
It has more in common with a doomsday cult than it does anything scientific, right?
Yeah, well, the word apocalypse means revelation. I think it stems from, I'm not sure if it's Latin or Greek, but it stems from the word revelation. So there's this completely biblical sense of the truth will be revealed through the catastrophe that we're going to encounter through climate change and so on, which is very much there because these climate change activists, and I'm not trying to bash them, because I mean, like if there is climate problems, then we should become aware of it. But they very much do take on, like, kind of almost immediately take on a kind of prophetic messiah kind of complex, which, and I don't know if you've seen Russell Brand's stand-up special he did, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. It was called Messiah Complex. And he's actually quite clever and it's quite relevant to this. He goes through all these different Messiah figures, from like Gandhi to, I think, with Malcolm X, and they're all in completely different time periods in history, and they're all in and Jesus as well. They're different time periods, and they're all different religions, some are secular, some are religious, and some are different religions, and so on. So there's this kind of, there seems to be these cycles of cyclical events which come about, which shouldn't be coming about in a secular progressive society, which we've, I think, falsely attributed it to religious societies. And they're kind of, it's like the return of the repressed, to use kind of Freudian terms. It's kind of come back. Yeah,
it's weird. I mean, just to hammer home the point, like, there's the same people who would be laughing at the guy standing on the street with the end is nigh sign or whatever are the ones holding the end is nigh sign and putting paint on soup on paintings and paint on buildings.
Tomato soup.
Tomato soup. I don't know, it's weird. I think that it's these eschatologies, they always assume the certainty of their outcome, right? Like the weirdest thing about the climate stuff is a lot of them say, oh, this thing is inevitable and we've effed it and the world is going to end.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what like doomsday cults are all about. Like they're like, oh no, the world is going to end.
Yeah.
I think it's all very strange. But it's, again, very dogmatic in its nature. Like you are as much a heretic going against the word of something like a religious figure as you are going against the consensus that the climate science people have.
Yeah. Well, did you know, like, Extinction Rebellion has been criticized by other, like, environmentalist types who say that they're consciously and cynically exaggerating the catastrophe in order to motivate people, and then they say, yeah, well, we're doing it because the ends are justified if we get to change things. It's just the means are a little bit cynical. So it would seem to me like some of these questions also come about in a time where there's a kind of a lack of common purpose. There's a lack of action. Like it's difficult to get people to see what's going on and to do something. Like you kind of have this declining Western civilization who we're kind of seeing it everywhere all around us, and we don't know how to do anything about it. And then all of a sudden you see these kind of doomsday cults come about, in which there's this hyper kind of emotionally volatile emphasis on action. We have to act. We have to do this. If we don't act now, the apocalypse is upon us. We have to, and it would strike me in your kind of schema of missing axioms and not having a kind of stable, let's say, grounding to move off of, that you would probably need a good stable grounding, something like progress or a god or something, or a kind of mutually understood threat that we're going to lose, we're going to be extinct if we don't save ourselves. There's some sort of grounding which motivates action, and it seems that we're kind of without a stable one. So then maybe as a response, these groups come in to try replace, whether that be religion or whether that be progress. They start to replace that with, catastrophe, crisis, end of the world, and so on.
I don't think anything motivates dogmatic acts more than fear.
Okay. Yeah.
It very much comes back to that, the fact that these are human, like, cognitive constructs, and they're very motivated by tribalism and the other and all these sorts of things, right? Like that could be, like religious judgment, like the fact that you're going to spend eternity in damnation, or it could be the fact that the climate's going to burn the earth, or we're all going to die in the fires, which is another interesting connection. They're both based on hellfire. Or just to take a hypothetical, maybe some sort of government that has lost its traditional function and maybe things aren't working so well, exaggerates some sort of virus that comes around to scare people into acting a certain dogmatic way.
What are you talking about?
Just a hypothetical.
Yeah, I'm actually reading at the moment this book. I don't know if you see it, the Metaphysics of Tsunamis, and I think it was written in like 2011 or something. It was written like well before COVID, anyway. And the guy who wrote it is he's basically saying what he's trying to do is enlightened doomsdaying. So he's trying to get us to think about. He thinks that we're incapable of understanding the reality of things like nuclear catastrophe and climate change and so on. It's a bit like we know rationally it's happening, but we don't really understand it's happening. So he kind of goes through different catastrophes and how we respond to them in various ways. So not to endorse it completely or like go on a tangent about it, but it does seem like this kind of eschatological theme does very much intrude into the kind of dogmatic, this kind of cyclical turn when the dogmatics are doubling down, and they're not really, like, the foundations are unstable and it's just doubling down, and there's a lack of, and perhaps maybe we can go into this now, perhaps this is all a result of the lack of iconoclastic intervention to a certain extent. So just to switch the conversation maybe onto the iconoclast now, because I think we've been talking about the dogmatists for a bit. The iconoclast seems to be, I was thinking of him as a sort of like productive mania. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but a kind of productive, a necessary evil maybe, and a productive mania. And is the iconoclast in his intrusion into a kind of failing dogmatic order, is his intrusion temporary? Like, can the iconoclast endure and sustain for an indefinite period of time, or is he just there kind of to intervene in a certain time period, disrupt things so that things can be kind of started over, recollected, and then built again, and then it goes back to the dogmatist? Or is he there for a more extended time period, let's say?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of make it very clear what we're talking about here, like the iconoclast and dogmatist aren't actually like people. They're just like they're like I said, archetypes. Like sometimes people cognitively think with a mode of iconoclasm, sometimes people think with dogmatism. Just to give an example from the book, I mean, it's very, very clear to me that, okay, there's this pure philosophy, this iconoclasm, which is very destructive, but, it makes way for new things to be created. is, okay, there's all this, like you said, there's this mania and there's this destruction, but it leaves space for something to be created. Now, without axioms, without something that you're assuming in the first instance, that you can't really create, right? And so just to give an example, people might describe Friedrich Nietzsche as a very iconoclastic philosopher, right? Like he was very clearly just came in and completely ripped Christianity a new one. But obviously there's this big empty space, and in his work towards a reevaluation of values, he sort of realized this, that wait, you can't just pluck definitive values out of thin air. You can choose some axioms and then go from that point. And my point in the book is I do have a chapter on Nietzsche, and I kind of point out, these are the ways in which he was iconoclastic. But you look into some of his work where he talks about the Apollonian Dionysian. In a way, those structures are dogmatic. Like he's saying these are fundamental parts of human existence, these two things. And yeah, later on, there's certain ways in which he becomes fairly dogmatic. I mean, not going as far as to make a system, and we all know that he kind of didn't finish that reevaluation of values, but it is kind of, it's that's the tragedy of the philosopher, I think. I think it's very clear. I mean, I call the work anti-philosophical in the sense that it's anti-philosophy in the sense that philosophy has been hitherto understood, right? So there's lots of people sitting in philosophy departments, but are they really engaging with the meta question? Are they really engaging with that? Or are they, in some way trapped in their sub-questions, I don't see in what sense a Nietzsche scholar is very iconoclastic at all. In fact, they're probably the most dogmatic people, because their entire standard of truth is based on what this guy wrote.
You have that one section, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's called the philosophical industrial complex?
The philosophical industrial estate, yeah.
Estate, a complex, estate, yeah.
Don't worry, it's too wordy anyway. I was pretty happy with that section though.
I like that title. It was good, and it seems like very much a critique of the modern academic institution.
Yeah, it's not very, there's not much subtext in that. It's pretty obvious what I'm talking about, right? But yeah, no, this is the thing, we've got these things called philosophical schools, and it's just pure philosophy, it doesn't get taught in a breeze block building on the edge of some sad campus, really.
Yeah, it's incredible too how I was thinking recently about how they grade philosophical essays, you know what I mean? They grade them. It's quite astonishing. It's quite astonishing, because you imagine grading one of Nietzsche's, imagine grading Zarathustra. It would be insane.
Well, yeah, exactly. This is why, great works like Thus Spake Zarathustra do not come out of the modern university. You get tomes and tomes and tomes of incredibly dry books about what is philosophy that are merely works of self-congratulation, if they're even that, that interesting at all. It's ridiculous. You'll have a essay about relativism that gets marked on objective criteria.
Yeah.
It's I can't even understand how we got to this point.
Yeah. You also seem to emphasize embodiment as important.
So the embodied context is something that I lent on a lot in Missing Axioms, but it basically comes down to the fact that okay, there's these cognitive extractions, and philosophy can be this abstract thing, but at the end of the day, we're embodied subjects. We have an existential experience, and whether we act or don't act implies a philosophical judgment. That's what I'm getting at with the embodied context.
It makes sense. That's kind of what I was getting at with the doomsday cults and so on. It's action. It's how there's knowledge, right? There's kind of rational knowledge, but then there's belief. And it's the embodied context would be very much, if you want, I think Zizek mentioned this before about psychoanalysis, which it was the psychoanalyst is not looking at what you're saying so much as what you're doing. He's looking for the embodied expression, and not and I think we talked about this with Missing Axioms before, the kind of embodied expression, the implicit versus the explicit and so on.
Yeah, I think people might also call that revealed preference.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like all these people talking about how the sea levels are going to rise, but they all want to buy beachfront properties. So
Yeah.
reveal preference, right?
Yeah. Um, so the I feel like I've also like obviously become very critical of the academic institutions and so on, and kind of just jumped off out of that. I'm not studying in a university anymore. I'm just doing it myself, and uh, I've just noticed the ways in which mechanisms and ways which create the right conditions for actual real philosophical inquiry are just so drastically different to what the university system presents, and not even in its really decadent phase of today. I think even like 50 years ago, just you have 3 years, you sit in a classroom, you do this exam, you do something. Yes, I have time to read a lot, right, and write a lot, so that does help stir the kind of rational inquiry. But then there's also the other forms of practices, we could say, and experiences which stir philosophical thought on some level. So you know, these these alternative philosophical, well, practices and experiences which condition philosophical thought. Are you trying to maybe push us in that direction, emphasize something like a philosophy more as a kind of mode of being, a continuous mode of being, as opposed to like a 3 year project or a credential and so on?
Sure, sure. Yeah. I think, I mean, I have a, I mean, I don't want people to take this the wrong way, but I'm definitely an elitist in the sense that, we brought into question question whether we can actually embody iconoclasm. And it's
Yeah.
very clear to me, like the majority of people aren't really up to that challenge. They need their dogmatism. They need to be told like what their axioms are and go from that point, right? And it's really clear to me through like the sort of egalitarian assumptions of the modern Western university is that, you have all these people doing philosophy, like usually because they don't know what else to do, right? It's not like for a genuine want to investigate or inquire, right? It's yeah, it's pretty clear to me that like, if you're inclined in that way and you think you have the ability, go for it. But yeah, it's very clear to me that, this comes down to the anti-philosophical conclusions of the book. Like, it's very clear to me that for the vast majority of humans, what that thing that we call philosophy is probably not a good thing for them.
How is it in what sense is it not good?
Like, I don't know, it doesn't help your average Joe to like question whether he knows what he knows. It doesn't.
Okay.
It's not useful. It's not desirable at all.
I've noticed that, like, if you talk to people that have never studied philosophy before,
Yeah,
they expect you, and you say, "Oh, I study philosophy," or especially if you say, "Oh, I'm a philosopher," or something like that. They normally somewhat jokingly, but it's their immediate response is to ask you something about, like, give them advice, like you're supposed to be some sort of
yeah, like
like
you're a guru or
yeah,
something.
like you're a guru. It's really weird. I'm just like, what? I like, that couldn't be further from what it is. I'm not sure where this assumption came from. It's really strange.
I blame self-help books and stuff like that
It could be a little bit
because
of
I
that.
think people
Yeah.
think that philosophy is the self-help stuff.
Hmm.
I don't think that people realize that it's not the same thing as that.
Yeah. Fair.
Um,
Because self-help would be quite a dogmatic act, because you would have to. I mean, if you think about like people, I want to be more successful. I want to make more money or something like that.
yeah,
I mean, there's just so much things that they've already assumed. If they think that they've already assumed a version of success and so on, which they're just asking for tips on how do they do it more efficiently.
sure.
They're not really questioning what that really means and so on. Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a lot of strange false assumptions about philosophy out there, which are kind of funny to encounter.
Well, self-help, I mean, doesn't really matter. I mean, does I guess it's just kind of independent of what it actually does substantively, but at least in its like axioms, it's dogmatic in the sense that it's pro-human. And this is kind of
Hmm.
in one of the senses, like people are very confused, and this is why I'm an elitist about philosophy, and also I'm an kind of anti-philosophical in a way, is because, well, philosophy, at least like pure philosophy in the sense that I would call like iconoclastic, is not necessarily a pro-human thing. It's actually a very like anti-human thing. It wants to kind of anthropomorphize everything, you know.
But is it not, I suppose, as like a kind of pushback against that, could you not say, well, philosophy is the exclusively human act? There's no other animals or living creatures that can do it. So,
yeah, but this is where it comes into question, right? Can humans philosophize? Really?
okay,
Do
so
they not have their biases and axioms all the time?
okay, so what you're saying is that your definition of philosophy is this iconoclastic kind of embodied position of thinking without axioms.
Yeah.
But do you think that is possible to do? Like, I suppose this goes back to is it possible at all, or is it possible to build a society on it? Is it possible to live by it through your entire life, or is it just like, or is it not possible at all?
Yeah, okay. Just like it's definitely not desirable to build a society on it. I mean, like I said, like
Yeah.
we can't all be philosophers, and most people don't have the either inclination or ability to do it. But yeah, our ability to actually philosophize is something I call into question in the book. It's not completely apparent to me that people can actually do that, or if they can do it, like for how long, right? Like everyone has to fall back somewhere, right?
There's yeah, because it seems to be it would seem like my intuition about it would be that it's it comes about during a sort of crisis of the axiom of the foundation.
Yeah.
And when the axiom and the foundation becomes so kind of wrong or unstable, or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, whatever that is, um, it sort of necessitates an iconoclastic retreat or an iconoclastic intervention. You can think of people having like an existential crisis in their life, and is that like an iconoclastic moment for them, where they suddenly have to, reevaluate like everything that has been motivating them for 10, 20 years and so on?
I think so. I think you're right, but I'm trying to go into this without presumption, right? Like I'm just open to the fact that we might not even be able to access this thing.
Okay.
And again, that's an answer I don't want to find as someone who's invested a lot of time into this inquiry, and I'm sure you'll feel the same.
So when you say you're not sure if it's possible to do philosophy, I suppose I immediately start thinking then of like, is there like epistemological limitations, to put it in the jargon, like, can we really know truth? Can we really access truth? Is there always a gap between us as humans? We're not God. We don't have this all-knowing, all-seeing knowledge. We have a sort of limitation in, like, for example, we can give examples of beauty. We can't really define beauty itself. Is kind of maybe the classical expression of that limitation. So is this inability to philosophize, how does this relate to a sort of like knowledge limitation? Is that the way to think about it?
Very, very possibly. I also think that it's an open question whether we can even like think without axioms. Like, I'm not trying to like single you out here, but like even when you're talking, then like the question of like, can we define beauty assumes that there is such a thing as beauty, for example. One of the examples from the book, and I get this from the Pharoneans, is that there's this distinction they have between academics, dogmatists, and the Pharoneans. So this very much relates to the logic I used with the religious atheist question, is the two philosophical positions, or people assume there are only two positions here, are that, okay, we can be dogmatic and say, yes, truth exists, or we can be what the Pharoneans called the academics, and they say, oh no, truth doesn't exist, it's all kind of relative. But the Pharonean might come in and say, well, those are equally as dogmatic in the same sense that either asserting or denying a creator God is just as like dogmatic. You don't have the knowledge to even know what the attribute of truth would look like, let alone like know if it exists, right?
Okay. So
Or even those things which don't seem dogmatic, like saying, "Oh, I'm a relative," it seems like, "Oh, that person's not dogmatic at all," but it's actually the complete opposite. Like saying that you know that truth doesn't exist for sure is a very dogmatic thing to say. This isn't.
yeah.
This isn't apparent, like,
Yeah.
but it's a problem in philosophy or philosophy. You know?
Okay. I see what you're saying. And people who don't know, how do you pronounce his name? The Feronian school of thought.
Pharaoh the Phronians, yeah.
Pharaoh. And is he Roman era philosopher? Or is he?
He's Greek,
He's Greek.
pre-Socratic.
Oh, he's a
I
pre-Socratic.
hope I'm
Okay.
right about that. I'm pretty sure he's Greek pre-Socratic. But
Okay.
yeah, the interesting thing about him is he's a main source for the book. Um, but we don't actually have anything like any direct sources on him. We don't know what he wrote. I don't think he wrote anything, but we don't even know what he said. But we
Okay.
have the source of this is Gaius Sextus Empiricus writing a lot later, talking about what he's a Pharonian, so this is what he thinks. So it's more of like a kind of zeitgeist Pharonian that I'm referencing in the book.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting because I was thinking about these same questions, and I thought that maybe the subjects in this book are going to be like, especially I'm talking about archetypes and all this sort of stuff. It's kind of esoteric. It's not entirely clear that these are actually things, and I might just be plucking them out of thin air. But discovering those sources and realizing that I'd thought of this iconoclastic / dogmatist distinction, and there was this very similar dogmatist academic Pharonian distinction defined by them. And it was just really weird to me, like how the word dogmatist was used as well. I found that kind of creepy, but it's probably the only reason why I actually continued to write this and finish it.
Fair. And also, I wanted to talk a little bit about Hume, because someone I haven't read. I've been meaning to read him, but I just haven't got around to it yet. So, you have a few kind of angles and things to say about Hume. One of the things you say about Hume is he's not a vulgar empiricist.
Mm-hmm.
So for people including me who don't know a whole lot about Hume, or at least have a very superficial kind of understanding of him, what's the kind of typical, we could probably, like academic, we could say, interpretation of Hume, and how does your interpretation differ?
Yeah, so I kind of really first encountered Hume at university, and it was one of those things where you literally spend 1 week on it, and they give you like I believe it was that it was a couple of tiny sections of an inquiry into human understanding where he talks about the billiard balls and all that sort of stuff. And the interpretation is Hume is one of the main empirical philosophers and all this sort of stuff. And I think at the time it kind of just conjured in my brain, it's like, oh, he's a proto like new atheist, let's just talk about the material, the cause and effect stuff. But then you realize that's an absolutely tiny couple of paragraphs of that book.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's wrong to say that he's an empiricist. That's definitely true. I mean, it comes from his, it informs his ethical naturalism, for example. And he does kind of question, the traditional religiosities and tries to give a biological explanation for these things, which I think he does very well in. But especially the inquiry into human understanding. And if you haven't read that, I would highly recommend it, because as a companion to this book, it works really well, because there is, at the surface of that book, he's quite blankly philosophical. He's talking about the billiard balls and all this sort of stuff, but there's a subtext to it where he is questioning the very use of philosophy, and in a way, and this relates to the cause and effect stuff, coming at it from a skeptical angle. And he definitely views himself as in the Pharonian tradition. And this kind of blew my mind. And I discovered I kind of read an inquiry into human understanding before, but I just went in with that. My brain was washed at university, and I went in with this angle of thinking I understood it and reading it one way. But then reading it again, you just get this whole different world. And again, like, you might think of him as a proto like new atheist empirical kind of philosopher, but one of the most revealing parts of that book is towards the end, and it definitely relates to my conclusions here in terms of, okay, what are we actually doing? What is the philosophical end game? Because he talks about it throughout the book. It's a very like well written bit of philosophy, but at the end of the book, he just says, all this stuff was giving me anxiety. Like, he gets like very personal about it. It's like a diary entry at the end. All this stuff was giving me anxiety, and basically I went and played billiards with my friend for a bit, and it cheered me up. made me like feel like I was, actually part of a community. Then he came back to his papers, the stuff he was writing, and it just feels like so abstract, lofty, and just like, what is the use of this stuff?
Yeah, fair. So I suppose that
I can relate. I can relate with Hume a lot because I felt that a lot when I was thinking about this book and thinking about what the hell we're actually doing with this inquiry.
that's actually something I think not a lot of people talk about that do philosophy is like how it kind of affects you on a day-to-day basis or
Sure.
socially, relationships or physically in terms of like exercise or you know what I mean, all these kinds of things, how you relate to confrontation, all these kinds of things like
Yeah.
that you don't really think about. Um, uh, like it's actually a really interesting topic. I was thinking when I was reading this about the iconoclastic kind of character motif archetype, however we want to put it, was a kind of as I was saying before, a kind of productive mania. That is really what I've kind of felt over the past year of doing like external outside the academy philosophical reading, writing, thinking is really a sort of like a kind of well managed mania that like I think if I had tried it like say 10 years ago would have destroyed my mind. Like I would have just I
Yeah.
wouldn't have been able to cope with it. And then and then you have to start thinking about like, well then why do so many philosophers in the past end up being kind of old when they're philosophizing? Well maybe, did they have to kind of discipline themselves to a certain level before they can go into it, or it can destroy you? I'm not sure. Like there's all these kinds of like, are you prepared to philosophize in the kind of social sense, in the physical sense, in the mental sense, in the emotional sense? I think a lot of that is quite an important question, and I've been doing a lot of kind of reading over the past year on like Plato's um, Republic, the first 5 sections or 6 sessions, which are based on this Guardian class, and the Guardian class are like kind of like it's written before you get to the kind of rational philosopher stage, and the Guardian class is very much a more embodied class, and it's all about it's more it's very much you can see how much it influenced Stoicism, for example, because it's very much about overcoming pleasure, overcoming pain. Do not let these things corrupt your reason. Do not let these things corrupt your mind. And there's this kind of disciplinary preparation, you can nearly say, before the properly philosophical ruler comes about in the book, which is more embodied. It's a bit more like military training. It's a bit more like social training and so on, which I think is something that the universities in general leave out. And I think that I just from personal experience, I don't think I'd be able to go into this stuff in this much detail 10 years ago. I wouldn't have been disciplined enough. It would have actually been bad for me, as you were saying earlier about is philosophy really good for everyone. And I think that that's something we don't talk about these days with philosophy. Like the things which prepare you for it, the things which train you for it, it's very much kind of not talked about, basically.
Yeah, I don't want to get too hokey on this, but like, I
Dude,
think
get really hokey. Go hokey as you want.
I think in a sense you have to want it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like religious in that sense, the philosophical inquiry, because I read Nietzsche when I was a teenager, and I took exactly what I wanted from it. I took a very dogmatic like
Okay.
stance on Nietzsche. I was just like, okay, I get to be the edgy atheist, but like that's not even close to understanding what Nietzsche's all about. And then coming across Hume in university and being like, just taking what I wanted from it. And once I escaped the institution in a sense, and found these really great online communities who completely opened my mind to like different way of looking at things, reevaluating everything. It brought a lot of maturity, I think. And you need to come at this stuff with a level of maturity which you can't just have. And you need to like want it,
Yeah.
and it like fate. The fate needs to like bring it to you as well. And this doesn't happen with everyone. Some people just end up with Hume, the vulgar empiricist, and that's just what they have for the rest of their lives. So I'm kind of grateful for that. And yeah, just I don't know, just to kind of maybe something you kind of teased out of my head a little bit. And maybe this is kind of a sort of a retribution of philosophy in the end, and maybe I'm too anti in a sense, because realizing that there is this philosophical iconoclasm which has these potentially mental, physical, emotional effects. which, like you said, we don't talk about, but it kind of is more evidence to my theory of philosophy as the meta question, because like what else would be able to influence you in that way by like just reading a thing on a page, right? It's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, like from a personal stance, I think philosophy has helped me realize when it's useful to be dogmatic. I feel like, for example,
Yeah, that's very
as
true. Yeah.
yeah, like as
100%.
a as a friend, I know to be dogmatic in certain ways to support my friends.
Yeah.
As a a brother, I know how to be dogmatic towards my family in the way that helps them. At work, there's certain things that you have to be dogmatic about, right, to
Yeah.
get along with everyone and do a good job. But like acting completely like iconoclastic at work might not be such a good idea. So it does help to
100%.
know when to employ these different mental modes. So if you know
Yeah.
if that's a bit of good advertising for the book, I don't know what is. So.
I think that what you're saying is like iconoclasm isn't just to destroy everything. It's almost to kind of trim off the fat and get the good dogma. Well, okay, maybe this isn't maybe this isn't the point of iconoclasm in purely from the iconoclastic perspective, but from the perspective of the embodied philosophical subject. I
Yeah.
think what you're saying is that it can help in the sense of helping you pick good axioms and helping you pick good dogmatic things to be dogmatic about, rather than just assuming these really stupid things to be dogmatic about, which are terrible. Terrible for you and terrible for everyone else. Yeah.
And maybe that's the point of that's like I said, that's the philosophical retribution in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, with this book and the conclusions, I haven't been too like definitive about okay, well, this is the conclusion. In a way, I haven't been very dogmatic with the conclusion.
Yeah.
I've kind of allowed people, I've presented some stuff, some findings, and some thoughts, but I do kind of, let the reader make up their own mind on this stuff, because I think that's actually part of the philosophical journey as well. I think a lot of bad philosophy tells you what to conclude. Like Hume
Yeah.
doesn't. Hume, like I said, he just like a diary. He ends it with, okay, this is what I experienced with the whole, the difference between common life and these lofty philosophical things. Now go away and make your own mind. Like Nietzsche does the same thing with Zarathustra at the end. Something that's supposed to be the new religious text in the end tells you to go and find out for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also I was thinking about the age of people that do philosophy as well. It's changed a lot, because I think that back in the day, whether it was ancient Greece or whether it was medieval Europe, or whether it was the times that Hume and Hobbes, early modern period, I suppose. To actually be in a position where you would have access to philosophical texts, you could read and write, which meant you were part of the elite.
Mm-hmm.
You had access to philosophical texts. Most of them were older. You were kind of in this position where I suppose they didn't really think or talk about it, because they were already in this position where they were prepared for this philosophical inquiry. And I think this is kind of to go back to the Republic. I think what Plato was doing in the Republic in a way is like, we can't just expect the 12-year-old to do philosophy. That's not going to work. We can't just expect this guy to do philosophy. He's just like a blacksmith. Like we have to create philosophical subjects, and there has to be a sort of process for that. So and that's my interpretation of what the Republic's all actually about. So it does fit into this kind of theme, this discussion. I think it's funny today because like we have access, like you can buy any philosophical book you want on Amazon, or just get a PDF for free online. You don't even have to pay for it.
Well, almost any book from Amazon. There are a few spicy ones you can't get on there anymore.
Dugan. Okay, so you can find nearly any, well, as it stands, it could change in the future, but as it stands, you can buy nearly any book, and if you can't get that, you can probably get it on Amazon, and if you can't get it, on PDF, and if you can't get it on PDF, I'm sure you could contact someone on Twitter who might have a PDF. You can get your hands on it if you look hard enough. And we're kind of overwhelmed with all this information. We have all this access to philosophical inquiry. Now you have people like myself included who are making book reviews and videos, and we're doing podcasts about philosophy. So we've kind of the access to philosophical thought is being democratized to such a crazy extent. But as you're saying, there is this other side to philosophy in like, well, if it's not handled well, it can be very destructive and it can be very bad for people. And there is this, at least there is some sort of argument for some sort of elitism, at least in the sense of wondering who is able to use it and who is able to, let's say, embody it and who is not able to embody it, and so on.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to become something that's going to become more of a discussion in the future, because we have so many people who are like teenagers reading Nietzsche and going, "Oh, I'm an atheist now, I'm a nihilist now," and it's like, this is insane. You're too fucking young to like even contemplate this shit. Like, you know what I mean? So yeah.
Yeah, I suggest any teenagers listening to this, put down the philosophy and go and cause some trouble in your local neighborhood.
Go and cause some trouble. Go break a window with a rock or something. That's what we used to do.
Yeah,
For fun.
go and embody your iconoclasm in someone's at someone's window. Yeah. Disavow. I didn't mean that. Disavow.
I'm not trying to bash anyone who's like young and trying to like study philosophy, because I'm sure you're doing I'm sure you're doing just as good as a job as anyone else. But I think there is something legitimately like, there's a vulgar way of saying life experience is very important, but then there is also something to that. There is also something to not just seeing philosophy as a kind of merely intellectual exercise or a kind of social fad to kind of get involved with. That there's a reflection on life that is actually lived, in a sense, which I think philosophy does quite well. But you kind of need to live life as well in order to have that experience to then reflect. So yeah,
it's one of my favorite quotes from Hume. Is he's just like, you know, like, be a philosopher, but despite all your philosophy, be still a man.
That's good. That's a good quote. That's a good quote.
It's really, it's a really important thing, like, and it kind of questions the whole, view of knowledge as propositional or esoteric. Like, for example, I can't like give a list of esoteric statements which summarize my knowledge and experience to a teenager, and then they immediately become like me. Like, they actually have to like go through that experience.
Yeah.
And that's one of the very human things which is a challenge for us. And I think maybe we need to stumble a bit more and just enjoy the journey.
Yeah. So I've kind of run out of like notes and questions to ask. So do you want to go over anything else? Talk about anything else?
No, it's been pretty fantastic. Go to iconoclast.energy. You can get the book in physical, digital. You can even buy it with crypto. Buy it.
Fantastic.
If you are, try and see if you are the iconoclast, because we might need you.
It's not a how-to guide, but you never know.
There's a few suggestions in there. There's a few suggestions.
There's a few tips.
What you could do, not that I'm endorsing anything specific, but
Step 1, buy my book.
Yeah, exactly. Step 1 is definitely buy the book. Yeah, 100%.
Fantastic.
You'll never